Good morning and welcome to this Infrastructure Victoria webinar on Victoria's coastline, the changes we're going to experience in the coast over coming decades. Almost every community in Victoria is going to have some effects from sea level rise, storm surge, and changes in our environment over coming decades. And this webinar is really going to draw what some of those big implications are for us as a society and our infrastructure. I'm Jonathan Spear, CEO of Infrastructure Victoria, and I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us this morning. Before I proceed any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting. I am in Melbourne, also known as NAM, at the Infrastructure Victoria offices on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and any who might be with us today. We've really got a great panel to be speaking about this subject today. We've got Anthony Boxshall. Anthony is the chair of the Victorian Marine and Coastal Council. We also have Jodi Kennedy, and Jodi is acting CEO of Bass Coast Shire Council. And Cath is joining us, and she's Director of Planning and Infrastructure at the Great Ocean Road Authority. Thank you for joining us, Cath. Now, you might have seen that Libby Mears was advertised to be taking part in this webinar. Unfortunately, Libby has come down with COVID, and so really pleased that Cath can join us today. And Libby, are wishing you a very rapid recovery. So it's a great panel we've got. We've got perspectives from across the state, which Anthony brings, and then the local government and Bass Coast perspective from Jodi, and Cath's perspective on the Great Ocean Road. At Infrastructure Victoria, we have a 30-year infrastructure strategy, and one of the recommendations in our strategy is that we need to focus on both adaptation to climate change and the effect it's going to have on our coastline, and have very selective investment in protection of key assets and infrastructure that will be affected by climate change across our coasts. So we're going to draw some of those implications out this morning, and we're going to start with Anthony. But before we dive into that, you will notice on your screens that there is a Q&A function. And so we're going to talk about some of the key themes, but then we'd love to hear from you and we'll answer some of your questions. So please get your questions coming through. In the latter half of this webinar, I'll be posing those to our expert panel and we'll be able to discuss that. So get those questions coming. So Anthony, let's start with you. When we step back a few paces, what is the nature of the challenge that we have with our coasts now and over coming decades as a result of climate change?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Look, thanks very much for the opportunity to talk about this topic, which is really essential because we need to plan for what's coming. I mean, at the very broad level, there's probably a couple of things that are happening. We're seeing major changes in weather patterns. And they, for example, changes in wind direction, and that means that you end up with changes in the coast, in the coastal alignment. So, for example, if you've been in Victoria in the last decade, you will have seen more easterly winds. And if you're old enough like me to remember 30, 40 years ago, there's a lot more than there used to be. That's the kind of thing that'll continue. We'll see more rains, we'll see more intense rain events, which means more flooding. You're seeing some of that, in northern New South Wales in the last couple of years, we had two 1 in 100 year events and one in 1,000 year event in 1 year. So that's the kind of thing that can happen. We're seeing the heating of the ocean. And so we're seeing that slowly heat up. The ocean's absorbed an enormous amount of what we've pumped into the atmosphere. And it's a huge buffer for us, but it's getting to a point where it's heating. We're also going to see, strangely, a change in the acidity of the ocean. Now, not to touch, it's going to hurt you when you touch it, but it is actually enough that it's changing the way that the organisms are able to form their shells, for example. If you're talking about aquaculture or any of those things that form shells. And probably the two biggest things we'll see from a coastal perspective, or three actually, is an increase in coastal erosion, an increase in sea level rise, and an increase in inundation because of both of those. So that's probably the broad brush picture. Some of the numbers, if people would have heard of the Paris Agreement, it's got various kind of goals in it. If we hit the Paris Agreement as a globe, if we get it together as a world and we hit the Paris Agreement, which by the way we're nowhere near, but if we do, we still have 72 centimetres of sea level rise locked in by 2100. If we don't hit it, we've probably got somewhere between 80 to 1.2 metres locked in by about 2100, 2120, if that's helpful, Jonathan.
Well, I'm not sure a metre of sea level rise is going to be helpful to anybody, Anthony, and that's part of the challenge, isn't it? Because we have lots of infrastructure that's located close to our coastlines, some of which is quite low-lying. We have houses, we have variable natural environment as well. Where are some of the places across Victoria that might be most vulnerable to this sea level rise?
Well, I mean, it's a great question, and it's different at different places. And so, as you mentioned, I mean, we're about 96% of our coastline of Victoria is actually is public land. It's Crown land, and so therefore it's a fantastic buffer. But it's also a double-edged sword because those places are places for recreation and social use and environment, and sometimes they're the last little remnants of really important habitats. They're also economically important and places where we all like to go and fish, for example. So you're right. The Victorian Marine and Coastal Council recently did an economics report on the impact, trying to get some dollar figures on some of these various impacts. And I might actually pop a slide up, read the detail, but the important point is that there are different colours, okay? And so if you work from the left to the right, you'll see that's actually across the coastline of Victoria. The left-hand side of your screen, I hope I'm getting that right, is the west, and the right-hand side is the east. And if you think about that as just kind of 8 different chunks of Victoria, the different colours represent different land use classes that are impacted economically. The y-axis is actually dollars, and it goes up to about $90 million. And so in some parts, on the western end, you're looking at more impact on reserves, interestingly, and also in the far east. In the middle, which is around Melbourne, you're looking at more impacts than commercial. Then as you go into some other parts, you're looking at more impacts to residential. You're looking at impacts that are quarry and mining in other parts, parks and reserves in other parts. And so the kinds of this particular research looked at 88 different land use classes. So you name it, we kind of calculated the impact, the economic impact to it. The overall economic impact, if we do nothing in the state of Victoria, which is unlikely, but if we do nothing to mitigate and adapt, the overall impact is about $442 billion to the economy by 2100, about $32 billion a year. That is about like having half the COVID hit to the economy every year. So there's a huge economic incentive to do something.
And that's a really big effect, as you've shown on the graph, across the whole of the state's coastline and its economic, social and environmental impact, isn't it, Anthony?
Absolutely. If you think about, what we do in that thin strip, 4 out of 5 Victorians use the coast every year.
Yeah.
And we might use it for a walk. We might use it because we love nature. We might use it because we fish. We might use it because it's culturally or spiritually important, as it is to some. There are so many businesses located right on it or right next to the coast. Think about the biggest infrastructure in Victoria, the biggest pieces of engineering. And where are they? Right on the coast. So we're talking about potentially large impacts to everything that is part of our economy and the fabric of how we operate, really, as a coastal people, because we are.
Yeah, and so that's obviously like a really big challenge in coming decades. And we've got some impacts now already, and probably it's a good time you talk about, favourite bits of infrastructure. Who doesn't love the Great Ocean Road? Cath, I know you do because it's your job, right? Tell us a bit about how the changes around our coastline are already affecting the Great Ocean Road, and what the authority is doing in terms of those impacts now, and what you think about in future.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, the Great Ocean Road, it's an amazing piece of infrastructure. It was built at the turn of the last century by returned servicemen. It's about 243 kilometres long, and it's an iconic coastal drive. We get more people going down the Great Ocean Road combined than any other place in Australia on an annual basis. So it's very important, not just for visitor and tourism economy, but also for local communities. And so at the moment, we're experiencing climate change on quite a regular basis with coastal impacts at Wye River, where we saw 15 metres of the coastline basically get eroded over a 3-year period, which was very concerning for that community, especially with regards to their Surf Life Saving Club and their bridge infrastructure there. We've also got things happening in Eastern View, Cozy Corner and Mans Bay, which are all people who are along the coast will know where they are. And we're spending a lot of money looking at how we can manage the impacts of climate change as it accelerates over time. So it's a really interesting conundrum we've got. We've got a community that's always has done particular activities along the coast for a long period of time, and changing conversation about what you can and can't do on the coast and how we can address the impacts of climate change is something that we're really galvanised to have that conversation with the community and with our local leaders and government over time. So it's an interesting space to be in at the moment.
Absolutely, and that Wye River example, of course, is a really tangible impact, and the Great Ocean Road, of course, has, we're heading into a period where we're going to have lots of people there, and Jodi, I know when we come across to the other side of the coast on your part of the world and Bass Coast, you're already gearing up for the many people who are going to come to your beautiful part of the world as the summer warms up. How's sea level rise and the changing climate starting to affect Bass Coast?
Thanks, Jonathan. Well, it's been affecting us for a fair while, and the biggest issue for us is we manage 42 kilometres of coastline. So really our environment's our economy. It's also our tourism market. We're the sort of the playground for the southeast suburbs. Everyone comes down often on weekends to enjoy the coastline, particularly in summer. So it's a very valued coastline, but it is a coastline that is particularly under threat. We've got a number of areas that are significantly impacted. So you're talking at Cowes East, Janjera, Kilcunda's had erosion, but in particular Inverloch. And a lot of people would be familiar with the Inverloch surf beach. So between 2012 and 2020, we lost 53 metres of coastline. That was averaging 7 metres a year. Now, that's to 2020. That was when we were having a lot of storm events around the Easter period. So sea level rise coupled with high king tides and storm events was really seeing that eroded away significantly. It's also a very dynamic coastline to begin with, so that is challenging as well. The last couple of years we've been fortunate that we haven't had those storm events at the Easter period, but they'll be just around the corner. So we've been working, what we've been doing is working with a number of agencies in Inverloch, so Parks Victoria, DECA, Regional Roads Victoria, and we work because we're all managing bits of the coastline and we can't all do our own little bits. We have to start to work more collaboratively because that amount of erosion was concerning for us, concerning for the community. We had roads under threat, so we decided to combine, and we've been working collaboratively to look at what does this look like now, but also into the future, and how do we start to plan for that?
Yeah, and those storm surge events, of course, when combined with some of the other sea level changes are really significant. We might come to you in a moment, Anthony, but before we do that, just a reminder to our audience, if you'd like to pose any questions for us to be discussing, for me to pose to our expert panellists later in this webinar, then you can do that. Put it in the Q&A tab below in the webinar screen. Anthony, this isn't just a hypothetical, is it? In terms of the effects of sea level rise, it is really quite tangible on how that might be affecting some bits of our coastline and even our suburbs that we know quite well. Have you like to share some further information about the sort of tangibility of the effects of this sea level rise on our communities?
Yeah, I think that, as Cath and Jodi were saying, it comes down to what happens at a location, and what that means for the community that lives there. And I apologise to those who may live around Elwood, or have friends who live there, but I'm going to show a quick animation that just gives you a sense of, it's actually quite a conservative estimate. And we'll come back actually to what we can do, because of course we are going to talk about what we can do. There are options which include retreat, which is a very hard conversation to have. But this particular animation just says, okay, when it gets bluer, that's more water. So this is a relationship of storm surge and sea level rise. So this is to 2040, this is 2070, and this is 2100. Now, not to be glib about it, but by 2100, looking at that, Elsternwick has a beach. Elsternwick's inland, for those who don't know. So the kinds of decisions that we're going to need to be making, and the kinds of things that both Jodi and Cath were alluding to, are really challenging conversations. We probably cannot simply armour the coast. We probably can't put walls up and live behind it, because, let's face it, the reason we like the coast is because it's got beaches and all the things that come with that. So armouring the coast won't fit us or our lifestyle. And so we've got to think about other ways, and there are other ways. We do have tools. And retreat is one of them. But I just think it's important. We could have picked, any number of locations, Jonathan, across the coast. We could have picked one in Jodi's area or one in Cath's area and run the same animation. That's what we're looking at in a really kind of tangible sense in the coming decades. We do have time, though. Get going sooner than later, it saves us later.
Yeah, and as in so many things, that's often the case, that a stitch in time saves nine. Of course, some of that information that you've been sharing, Anthony, the graph and some of those maps, they're available on the Coastal Council website. If anyone who's joining us today would like to dig in deeper in that, I think a question for all of you to pitch in on. Anthony's talked about the sea level rise, but it's not just the rise of sea level, is it? Jodi, you talked about the storm surges and so forth. So how does this all work together, and what's the effects of sea level rise with other climatic and ocean effects?
I can jump in. I think one of the challenges is that we are at the moment we do look at it a bit in isolation. We look at sea level rise, and then we're looking at storm events. We actually need to bring the two together, and erosion. And we need to provide community and local government with the right tools so that we can inform the community about those risks. So for me, in the planning scheme, we've got what's called a land subject to inundation overlay. And I think it sort of works to a certain point, but I think we probably need better tools to help inform and help map and predict what's going on, and then, what other solutions that are required. And I think it's a challenging space to be in, but I think that the time's now, because I know when I first started working down here at Bass Coast, climate change was not something you could talk about. It was, it's not, it doesn't exist. Whereas now we've declared a climate emergency, and we've got communities really concerned about what's happening in their backyard. And I think that's one of the things that we've got a really good opportunity, and that's working with community to come up with the solutions, because we've got to come up with solutions that value the community's values, and they value the coastline. So how do you get the right balance between hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure, retreat? What's the right response in particular location? And it does come down to each location, and you have to deal with them in different ways. It's not a cookie cutter response that we're looking for here.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, Jodi, the locational nature, and also the conversation with community and the increasing understanding about this. And Cath, turning to you now, how's that playing out across the Great Ocean Road? What's the quality of the conversation like, and the acknowledgement of this challenge, and where is that pinch being felt most currently? We've We've talked about Wye River, but are there any other locations?
Yeah, it's a really interesting space that we're in. We've got some great legislation and some great tools that have been developed over the last 5 years or so. We've got the Victoria's Resilient Coast Adapting to 2100 piece of work that's been done, which really takes us through, stepping through with community conversations about what we can do in the space from avoiding building infrastructure to accommodating it to retreating to protecting. So for us, that protection conversation is really the last resort for us now because of the cost that's involved in those kind of spaces. With the Marine and Coastal Act, which was endorsed in 2018, and the policy in 2020. There's some really great stuff around the coastal adaptation and resilience planning work that is being done along our coast. And that's a really important tool for us because there's an old saying, I think it's in God we trust, but everybody else must bring data. And that's a really powerful thing to bring to the table when you're talking to community about why, though their childhood memories from 60 years ago of I used to do this on the coast and I want my grandchildren to do that or my grandchildren to do that, that's going to have to change. And the only way we can do that is not just hearts and minds, but cold, hard facts. So, and balancing that is a really interesting place to be at the moment because it is a tightrope because you will get conversations where you will provide someone with a coastal hazard assessment which says, by the way, sea level rise based on the 0.8 sea level rise, which probably will go up over time because of the fact that our environment is heating a lot quicker than what we want it to, means that those places on the coast where people recreate or they have a surf club or a fishing club or a pier or anything like that, it's like that they're going to be impacted by not just a storm surge and an event, but also just generally by the fact that your high water mark is going to be higher, and you're going to have those moments in time.
Can I jump in as well? I just think that's a really critical point you say, Cath, about the cold hard facts of it are really essential to bring into the conversation with people. And one of the very interesting pieces or findings out of the economics research was it's cheaper to invest earlier in adaptation. And so the economists, dispassionately looked at the costs, which were, shocking, as I mentioned earlier, some of the numbers. But dispassionately, if we spend something to avoid $1 of impact in 2040, we're avoiding the equivalent of $4 in 2070 or $10 in 2100. So the cold, hard economics of it is it's cheaper to adapt earlier. And part of one of the conversations that we were trying to have, and we are still trying to have with sectors like this sector, for example, is here is the denominator for the business case. And so whatever you do to invest, to adapt, you can use on the top and you can work out your return on an investment. Because often that's the challenge when you're looking at an uncertain future, trying to pin down what that cost will be. Now, that doesn't address any of the heart and mind challenges, as Cath was raising, of course, which are then and Jodi too, how do you have those conversations with communities? And I think just to pick that up, it's about leadership. It's about just owning it. It's about us collectively as leaders throughout the system saying, look, here's some realities, and we can choose to pretend the freight train of the future is not coming at us, or we can choose to engage with it. And we can use the tools that exist. And as Cath mentioned, there's a bunch of good tools. We've got kind of like a really nice electric vehicle built, and we just have to plug it in, charge it, and get it going. And, tweak it on the way. As Jodi said, there are some new tools that might be needed. But it really is time to do something.
Yeah, and that's a really great call to action, Anthony. And when we look at other jurisdictions, they're facing similar challenges, aren't they? So when we look across the border to other states in Australia or even internationally, what do we see as some of the leading efforts that are being made that we might want to borrow and adapt for our coastline here in Victoria?
I'm happy to talk about some of the things I've seen, but over to you guys if you want to jump in.
I'll probably just say, I think one of the things, and Anthony and I have spoke about this a bit, is around the needing to have the conversation around retreat now, because it's a long game. We need to start the conversations now and look at the frameworks and the legislation, all those things that are going to be required for that. I know there are models in the US and the UK. Whether they're appropriate for us is yet to be determined. But we need to start having that conversation, and we need leadership from federal and state and local government. So it really does require the three levels of government working together. Local government's the closest to the community, and our role is really to work with and bring community along in those conversations. But we really do need a statewide approach to this, and also funding from the Commonwealth. If you look at the amount of money that we've been spending here just to maintain and protect our beaches at the moment, whilst we're doing that long-term work, because you've got to do the interim as well as while you're planning for the longer term, it's a significant burden for local government.
Yeah, and Jodi, I mean, that's a good point. And there are different roles that different levels of government have. And, you know, Cath talked before about in God we trust, everybody else brings data. Maybe in God we trust, but somebody's got to bring cash as well.
Spot on. Yeah, you know, it's interesting in the UK, Jodi talked about retreat. They've moved a town in Wales already because of a climate change affected, essentially what was happening with it was probably built in the wrong place in the first place. But you know, so it is happening. Even in Victoria, we've moved a town before in Jodi's patch. We moved it for penguins. Summerlands on Phillip Island. So we've made choices about deciding to move infrastructure and people for various things, and it's just something that we will have to do a little more of. California, with Big Sur, which with all due respect, Cath, is like Great Ocean Road on steroids. What Caltrans has done there is where there's been constant slips, which they do have geologically there, so it's a little bit different than we do here, but also with the undercutting and the changes of what's happening with the ocean there, they've moved parts of that road essentially out into the ocean on stilts. Now, These are decisions you can choose to make and cost. I just don't feel that we're having that conversation as a society yet.
Yeah, I'd agree, Anthony, on that. We do need to be really brave in the conversations we have and give our leaders support in that bravery as well, by providing that information, by providing them with that hard data that we need, and also working with the community to bring them on the journey, because, the Great Ocean Road is a memorial. It has has a lot of moving parts to that particular road. It's not just a road. It's got the NBN under it. It's got sewer. It's got water. It's got all this stuff underneath it. If that's going to be in the sea in 50 years' time, so to speak, what's going to happen with all that infrastructure? So working as well with our major infrastructure providers for those hard conversations about that they need to forward plan now for where those critical pieces of infrastructure are going to go. And I think one of the interesting things is my background is landscape architecture. So I'm really interested in the Crown land that I look after from a piece of critical infrastructure, as in green infrastructure. So where are our public parks going to be? Where is our environmental places going to be, our refuge for our beautiful flora and fauna, as sea level rises and that is eroded away, and we are starting to come into a place where what's left is technically private land in many parts of our coastline. Obviously, on the Great Ocean Road, we're really lucky. We have a lot of national park, but it is a conversation that really needs to be had.
That's a really great point, Cath, about the range of infrastructure too that you have aligned with roads that are close to coasts, where many of these utilities are located, in, on, under the roads that we're thinking about, and then the public and green space as well as, and so they affect on both the utilities that make our society work, the roads, of course, that are so critical for access to all sorts of services, and the economic effects, and the tourism, of course, and the green spaces are, really big impacts. When we look around the world, is there any jurisdiction that is showing glimmers of doing this sort of adaptation really well, or is there? We've so far talked about managed and planned retreat and some of the infrastructure investment where that's makes sense but can be very expensive. What are some other examples of things we could borrow and use?
There's the Scandinavians seem to be good at just about everything, and there are some really good examples of adaptation planning, particularly for some of those lower lying countries, and if you go back into Europe and Europe proper, we're around Holland, etc. There are also local, large scale local or regional examples. So if we look at, if you look at the ways you can intervene, the first thing is to actually avoid doing silly new things. So when we're planning new things, we put them, out of the harm from the sea. So avoid making future bad decisions. And we usually do that with planning benchmarks, and pretty much Australia is pretty close to leading in that all jurisdictions have a statewide planning benchmark except New South Wales, which is a sea level rise planning benchmark. New South Wales leaves it to local government to decide, which is challenging for New South Wales because you get local governments with different perspectives on climate change. Interestingly, around the country, all of those sea level benchmarks are different, which is just the nature of our federation, but somewhat frustrating because the ocean actually just rises pretty much roughly at the same rate everywhere. Then the next thing you can do is, as Cath mentioned, is accommodate. There's a really great example of accommodating, which is not so much a climate change accommodation, but when Katrina went through in New Orleans, when Hurricane Katrina went through New Orleans, they redesigned New Orleans. So they didn't build the barriers back up. What they did was they redesigned New Orleans so knowing the ocean would come in, and then designed it so that the flow patterns of streets, etc., became drainage lines, and it runs back out again, and the houses are slightly raised. So you can use urban design to accommodate. You can build nature-based defences. They take a good couple of decades to really build up. You build them offshore. They're doing that in the Middle East, in the US, in Europe, a large program restoring coastal areas called Rest Coasts in Europe. 9 different countries, 13 different locations from Spain to Israel. Then, of course, you can retreat. We've talked about that. And the last one you can do is to armour now and protect. And the UK has done a risk assessment and worked out that they're likely to need, by 2050 or 60, 45% of their coast armoured, which I just don't think will work here. They're already putting barrages across the Thames. In Italy, they've put barrages across the inlet to where Venice is, the Venice Inlet. Now, they're quite shallow and quite controllable, for want of a better term. I don't think we could do that in Sydney Harbour or Port Phillip Bay or even Port of Brisbane. I just don't see that scale of infrastructure being able to be built here. So there are examples all over the place, I think, Jonathan, where we can draw, of those 5 interventions, we can draw examples that could work on our coastline.
Yeah, absolutely. And please do keep your questions coming through. We're going to get to those shortly, and there's some good ones coming through already. Before we get to there, Jodi, turning to you, there's certainly been some media coverage over recent years around some of the land use planning challenges that happen in low-lying coastal areas, and places that spring to mind are certainly around your part of the world in Gippsland, but also in the west of the state around Port Fairy and places like that. From local government's perspective, I can imagine this could be quite challenging in terms of people's expectations about the use of private land and where places can be developed. How are you and other local governments navigating through that challenge?
I think that's the right word. It is a challenge. So when we started, we did a coastal hazard assessment, or state government did, for Western Port, and that was quite a while ago now, 10 years ago, and we were looking to put that into the planning scheme. So we were the first to introduce the land subject inundation overlay into the planning scheme. it's a tool, but it still needs a lot of modification. So if you think about it, if every council is implementing that tool and modifying it, we're not getting consistency across the state, and it's not being applied consistently. So when we did that, it was a real challenge. I remember at the time we were told that was not the most appropriate tool, and I said, well, give me a tool that does work, and there isn't one. So that's what we're working on. I think for me, we can help local government and state government. So once we've done the science, so the science is done at the state level, the coastal hazard assessment, so we've done one for Inverloch just recently, that data should just go straight into the planning scheme. And I think we need to start to look at our legislation and our planning schemes in a way that creates a framework for science to be updated on a regular basis, because the cost of doing a planning scheme amendment is significant to local government. And it's time. So you've got the data now, but the actual control's not going into the planning scheme for 18 months, 2 years, 4, 5 years. There's a risk there. So, once you have that information, we need to make sure that we are sharing that and we're being open about the risks to property owners. So that, for me, is an opportunity where I think the state could lead in terms of putting the data in. And it's very similar to what they did for the bushfire management overlay. So once the data's in, you put it in. If local government want to be more nuanced, then they go and do a planning scheme amendment for that. But I think we really need to have that leadership there. And that would then free up a lot of time and money that can be put into more longer term solutions. And I think just picking up on the point before that with, what's happening around the world and elsewhere, I think the other thing we need to look at with coastal inundation, sea level rise is we're talking about short term and we're talking about long term, but what's that medium stuff that property owners can be doing with their properties in the interim? I don't think we've actually addressed that at all, but I think we do need to, because we're seeing decisions being made now where people can't make very minor modifications to their home because it's going to be, predicted to be inundated in by 2100. So how do we manage existing within that? I think is something we need to turn our minds to.
Yeah, absolutely, Jodi. And this is a question that people got now. And in fact, one of the questions that we've had come through is really on this subject. So this is a question from the fabulously and appropriately named Skipper Pete. And Skipper Pete asks, as a resident and business owner in Lakes Entrance, there are many rumours and fear of what is going to happen. What can tourism operators like Skipper Pete send residents and tourists to get accurate information? So right now, what would be your advice about where to get the most accurate information about sea level rise effects that people who are running businesses can use to help plan for?
I think in the state of Victoria, the most up to date and useful information is that it's held by DECA, the Department for Environment, Energy and Climate Action, and you can Google on their site essentially a climate information portal, and you can zoom in to your local area. You can even, for want of a better term, play a little and look at, what happens to the tides, what happens to the sea level, what happens to the winds, and it can give people quite good data. There's a national tool called Coast Adapt as well, and the Coastal Council have again, something we can select different climate indicators, or the Climate Council, I beg your pardon, which is a climate risk and hazard tool, which looks more at the risk to areas from different climate impacts. They're probably the three that are probably the most easily accessible and I would say user-friendly that are available.
Great, thanks, Anthony. I'm sure that Skipper Pete and any of our other members who of the audience can jump on and have a look at that. Another question that we've had come through is from Cameron, and talk about how we do disaster recovery. And I would say this is a question that comes up not just in relation to coastal floods and sea level rise. So it's a great question. And so in terms of disaster recovery, it's interesting to note that generally damaged infrastructure is replaced like for like because of the way that funding is distributed. So we're back to the cold hard cash again. What can we be doing to make sure that we're not replicating that challenge and that the infrastructure that's replaced is resilient?
Who wants to go first? I think
Oh,
we've got this.
look, it's a wicked problem that we've got, not just with bushfires, etc., but also the coastal impacts that we're experiencing. And there is, I think we really do need a change in legislative approach to have funding is given out in regards to disaster management. It's always after the fact rather than before the fact, and we really need to be changing our funding models at all levels of government to ensure that as we learn more, that we do better. So that would be my first thing to say.
Yeah, and Cath, certainly analysis we've done shows that the vast majority of funding goes to disaster recovery rather than adaptation to the effects of climate change. How are you, Jodi? How are you seeing and this playing out in Best Coast in terms of making sure we don't replace things like for like?
I think that's an issue too with the people's insurance. So you only get insured for what you had, not what you should be putting back in, or building back better. So again, the conversation we need to be having with insurance councils as well around how do we ensure that people who are impacted by disaster can actually afford to build back better. I think one of the things we've been doing at Bass Coast is we're really looking at this in a holistic approach for disaster recovery. So we're heading into that season now, and I've got emergency management and community planning in my portfolio. And what we've done is we've put the community planners and emergency management team together because we really believe that we need to be working with the community to assist them to be resilient, be aware that they need to take a lead when we are in an emergency as well, because we all know that we're not going to be able to get to all the events if and when they occur. We've seen that before previously. So I think it was 18 months, 2 years ago, we got hit by a fairly significant storm. And we even had our communications go down. So, and people weren't able to access fuel, power, and telecommunications. So it was quite a significant event. So we've learnt a fair bit from that. And we're working really closely with our neighbours as well on what does that look like going forward. But I think just picking up on the point before around disaster recovery, I was reflecting on a panel, I think, Anthony, you were on recently, that we had down at Lawn. And we talk about recovery and recovery authorities. So Queensland and New South Wales have recovery authorities. And I've been thinking we actually need to have an authority that's more of the preventative. So what can we be doing so that we're actually flipping that spend at the front end, not the back end. So we're sort of always structuring ourselves for the disaster, not for what can we do to mitigate.
I was going to pick that one up as well, Jodi, because I think that's exactly right. I look at what there's ex-emergency management commissioners that come together for climate, and one of the points they make is I think the spending is something like 9-1 the wrong way. If it was 9-1 for preparation for recovery, we'd probably have less impact from emergency. And one of the challenges with this, Jonathan, and this is actually one of the things that's really positive about the large-scale infrastructure sector, is we call the problem is we call the tragedy of the horizon. This impact, this threat, is far enough ahead of us that we could put off next year. Oh, we'll just wait till next year. We'll wait till next year. And we keep doing that, and then all of a sudden it's on us. It's not like, say, bushfires, where we literally have that unfortunate opportunity to have to clean up every summer, and therefore we can tweak the way we do things. And so, if you look at the levers of change and the timelines, if this is a crisis that has a 20-year timeline, which it kind of does in a way, decadal timeline, budgets are about 1 to 3 year cycles. So that's not the lever we pull. Electoral cycles, depending on where you are, between 2 to 4 years, local, state and federal. That's not the lever to pull. Residential properties get turned over in Australia at about between 9 to 13 years. That's not the lever to pull. Small-scale infrastructure investments, 10-year amortisation cycles. The only thing that exists on the timescale of thinking is large-scale infrastructure investment and super funds. Now, super funds are not going to invest their way out for us, and large-scale infrastructure is not going to be. But we can take something from the thinking that as a society we use for large-scale infrastructure. We're planning tunnels in Victoria for 2080. So why aren't we planning coastal adaptive processes? And I do think Jodi's right when she says that maybe there's just not the authority, there's not the entity who does the thinking. Because if we had a blueprint, we all had an agreed blueprint for what, Victoria's coast was like in 2050 or 2070, these things would occur and people could invest to that blueprint. I think that's the thing we've got time for now, is to have that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was struck by your point about the relatively predictable long-term trajectory that we are on with sea level change. And the analogy I draw is Infrastructure Victoria has just published some work called Choosing Victoria's Future, which was about the choices we make with the relatively predictable population growth and change we're going to have, and strategic land use planning and strategic infrastructure investment that we need to make over decades. And it's a really good analogy with this challenge, I think, where it's not it is a day thing in terms of there being changes in our coast, just like there's changes in our population, but it's quite predictable what the future changes are going to be. And we can either start to prepare for them now or pay a higher price later on, perhaps.
I think that's absolutely right. And I love something you said earlier, Cath, about this is we have to enable leadership to make the hard calls, because I am not a politician, and I couldn't, never be. I have such respect for politicians and the job they do, the decisions they need to make. And what we're asking them to do in this circumstance is to privilege future beneficiaries over current beneficiaries, i.e. voters. So the people who are currently potentially going to, feel aggrieved or be impacted by decisions that are absolutely necessary for the future of our economy, our environment, our social cohesion. We have to enable those leaders to make those calls. And we do it with, as you say, strategic, scaled planning for the infrastructure. And it's not too much of too much of a stretch to say, well, these are things, as you say, are quite predictable. Maybe we should do this and create a blueprint for the future.
So if any of our audience members have any questions they'd like to put through, please, we've still got a little bit of time. You can put it into the Q&A function beneath your screen. In the meantime, I'm going to hand out a magic wand to each one of our panellists. Let's get practical. Let's get, what do you want? So we've talked about some of the options and some of the challenges and what other jurisdictions are doing. But, Cath, I might start with you. I'm going to hand you the magic wand, and what would you like now? And what do you think we need to be starting to do now that'll set us up better for the future, so we can sort of address some of that challenge that Anthony's called out?
Okay, I'll go first. So it's a great question. I think for me, if I had my magic wand, we've got some, Jodi and Anthony touched on that legislative tool that we have and a consistency of the tool. And when I knew that this question was coming, I wrote down consistent application across jurisdictions. But I actually think it's more than that. It's also the interpretation across jurisdictions, so that when community in a certain part of Victoria, for example, looks at another part of Victoria and says, hey, how come they can do that and we can't do that? There's a really strong messaging and understanding of why it's place-based planning or place-based infrastructure, and what all the bits of the recipe that went into that decision-making. So, that kind of tool would be really helpful. And then the last thing I'd say is I think utilising AI and the data, we are really good at collecting data. It's how we interpret that data that it's often lets us down. We like to store it in lots of places. I don't know how many photos I've got online, but it's more than I ever look at in the year. But I think if we had really played the digital twin for Victoria and the coastline and start doing some really interesting modelling about where we're putting infrastructure, different types of infrastructure, the what ifs, would that work? And then run that over a period of time just to start to see what we can do in that space. I think Anthony mentioned before with regards to interventions offshore. So we often look at the land, the coastline, and look at hard infrastructure on the coast that you can see. And it obviously has a pretty big impact on the visual amenity and often the ecology of a space if you're putting rock walls and revetments in. What happens if we start creating reef systems? What would that mean? Would that change? Obviously, it would change sea processes with regards to sand movement. We all experience that with the groins that we've put in across Great Ocean Road and Gippsland. But that kind of thing, looking at those models, that I think would be really hold us in good stead.
Yep, great, Cath. So there's some really practical changes, both physically, but also the legislation and how we apply it. I know you're a sharing kind of person, so we'll let you hand over the magic wand to Jodi. And what do you think, Jodi? What are the things you would really like to see happen now, and then set us up well for the future to deal with the challenge of our changing coastlines?
Obviously, I was going to say the framework, but the other one I think that's really important is we need to have a consistent collaborative approach from federal, state and local. The community don't care who's making the decision. They just want decisions made, and they want leadership in this space. And I think that's what's really required. So I think if we could get all levels and being really clear about roles and responsibility, I think that's the other key thing here is what is the role of the Commonwealth, what is the role of the state, and what is the role of local government? Because I think at the moment it's a little bit confused. And I think for the community that's difficult. And if we can get that collaboration and get some, we all don't have the solutions and we all don't have the cash. So how do we work collectively to make the best of what we've got? And then my other one would be money, because it's just moving sand up and down the coastline to protect our beaches is a very expensive exercise. So these are the things that do impact, and for local governments, and particularly smaller local governments, it is a significant burden on their budget each year.
Yeah, and Jodi, maybe let's just dig in a little bit more to those different roles of the different levels of government. What do you think is, say, the ideal role that the state and federal government can play? You've described a bit about the challenge and the role of local government, but where do you think that would be optimally focused?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Anthony mentioned that every state has a different measure. I think that's probably a really good one if we have consistency across the country around sea level rise and what our predictions and requirements are. That would be a good start. I think funding from Commonwealth, but I think state really has the role of leadership in terms of consistent planning, consistent retreat, consistent implementation, and then local government works on the nuance and works with bringing community along and working because the other thing is the community know their coast and they know their land better than anybody else. So they've got some really good information that we can be gathering and inputting into and alongside the data. So I think that's a really important thing. And we did that when we did the implementation of the land subject to inundation overlay. The farmers know where their land was flooding. They knew it better than anybody else in the room, and that really helped inform the outcome that we delivered. So I think that's the role of local government, is to work with and bring community to the table, and then work with state government and state governments to set the framework on which we operate within.
Yeah, thanks, Jodi. And I imagine you wouldn't mind some cash from the federal government as well. Before we hand the magic wand to Anthony, for those of you who are watching this, you'll see that we have a poll that you can fill in, and it's in the same part of your screen as the Q&A function, one of the tabs there. We'd love to hear from you about what you think about this webinar and how we can do better. We run webinars across all sorts of different subjects, and I think this is a really great example of us trying to broaden out the discussion across different sectors and different challenges. So please, as we're concluding this webinar, let us know what you think and what you'd like to see in the future. But Anthony, congratulations! You've got the magic wand. what do you want to see happen now, and what's going to set us up really well for the future?
Gosh, you two are a hard act to follow with your magic wand waving. Cash is one, but I think probably if I go back to the work that when the Victorian Marine Coastal Council and Lifesaving Victoria and others partnered on that economics report, we wrote a summary report, which people, if you Google Victorian Marine Coastal Council economics or Compass report, who's the Professor Compass is the author, you'll find it. In there, if I had my magic wand, I think we called for a task force. Now, I know that sounds a bit kind of, task force, but the idea is that what we would do is we'd have a highly multidisciplinary group of forward thinkers come together and build that blueprint, kind of build that blueprint for that future, normalize the conversation at a kind of a state leadership level. It could be chaired by a couple of ex-premiers. You could have the chief architect, the chief, engineer. You could literally have a really great conversation about the kinds of solutions which need to be, as Cath said earlier, it's a wicked problem. So they need to be multi-sectoral solutions. You need the economists in there, you need the developers in there, you need everybody to have a say. And we bring the community in and normalise the conversation. And in doing that, we'd probably come up with some ideas for, I think we need a future fund, kind of a coastal adaptation future fund, because seriously, nobody is going to be able to invest the levels if we wait for it to hit. But even if we want to do it properly, we're going to have large amounts of money. Even if you took 10% of that economic impact and invested it, that's probably going to be helpful, but it may just be a start. And so if we had some kind of, future fund for the coasts where future governments could allocate to the preparation side of it, that could be also useful. So, I'm really definitely waving the magic wand there, Jonathan. But those are the kinds of things that will normalise the conversation and create an evidence-based pathway for multi-sectoral reform, which is really what's needed.
And it sounds like from what, Anthony, you've been saying in particular, but also with Jodi and Cath, that we can't build our way out of this. We can't armour our way out of this. And so when we're talking about funding, it's not necessarily about, lots and lots of armouring of our coast. It's about being very selective and about changing and adapting. And one of the questions that's come through, I wanted to dive a bit more deeply on, what do improved planning controls look like, and how would they identify hazards and function differently to what we've got now? Maybe that's one for you, Jodi. I know you've done a bit of thinking about this.
Yeah, I think that the planning control would look at actually having sea level rise and erosion in the one tool. So at the moment, you've got to use the land subject inundation overlay, and then you've got to use the erosion management overlay. And it's fraught with complexity, whereas I think, and some work was done quite a few years ago, there was an advisory committee that did look at a coastal erosion management overlay, I think, or along those lines. And I think if we got that report out, dusted it off, looked at what's been happening since then, we could probably come up with a pretty good tool that would be implementable fairly quickly. And I think it sends a signal that, this is an important issue for all of us. So I think that's how I think that tool could work. And I also think that we just need consistency in some of the stuff across the state, and that as soon as we have the data, it goes into planning schemes. Because insurance councils and the like, they've got access to this data, they're using it. We need to make sure it's in our planning schemes as soon as it's available.
Yeah, and that consistency, of course, is something that Cath was calling out as well. Now, we've got one last question that's come through from Simon, and I think it's a really good way to finish off. So thanks for your question, Simon. It did point out that we've talked a lot about the costs of adaptation. What are the opportunities for our communities that we could get for our coastal areas? How can we do better for communities and visitors, and of course for nature, as we go through this adaptation in future?
I think we can. One of the things we can do. It's a great question too, because I think one of the things we can do by future proofing, we make life easier. We make our coastal areas more functional for us. We make them the places we want to keep visiting, rather than constantly having to kind of, build up that wall, or, feel like you're in a state of concern about the future. So I think that there's a peace of mind, but also when we do different types of urban design, we'll find that we'll actually produce wonderfully more livable coastal cities and coastal towns and villages, because we'll have thought it through a bit more than perhaps we did, when they just got plonked there accidentally over the last couple of 100 years. So I think there is a real opportunity in that.
Yeah, and Cath, what do you think? What are the big opportunities that we've got here?
I think, just leading on from what Anthony is saying, it's creating those multifunctional place-based appropriate infrastructure, social infrastructure, cultural infrastructure we need in these spaces.
Thanks. And how about you, Jodi? What's the opportunity that you see as being the biggest?
Yep, I was probably similar to Anthony, but I'll go a different focus, and that's about educating community and getting greater ownership of what's happening. Nothing like a crisis to bring people together sometimes. But that's a really opportunity where people actually understand how the coast works, how do they interact with the coast, and also the value of the coastline, and then how do they value add. So, if we get the right urban design and the right framework in place, what can communities then do in that space to collaborate?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is a challenge that isn't going to go away. I really want to thank our panellists, Anthony, Cath, and Jodi, for joining us today and for your insights. There's a recording of the webinar that's available, that'll be published. And if anyone who's watching this would like to give us their final thoughts on the poll that's been put up, then that'd be very much appreciated. And let us know what you'd like to see in future webinars Infrastructure Victoria runs. You can find more information about what we've been talking about today, both on the Victorian Marine and Coastal Council website, as Anthony's been talking about, the DECA website, and Victoria's infrastructure strategy has a section and specific recommendations about adaptation to the effects of climate change. If you want to dive in and have a look at the advice that Infrastructure Victoria has been giving to the Victorian Government and Parliament on the ways we can plan to get some better results and good opportunities and mitigate some of these risks while we adapt to climate change. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'll look forward to seeing you at either a future Infrastructure Victoria webinar or other events soon. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you. Goodbye.